Queen Camilla just lost every right she ever had to Windsor Castle, and the person who took it all away has been gone for years. This wasn't announced from a balcony or delivered through some elegant royal address. There was no carefully staged press conference, no soft language crafted by palace communications. Instead, it arrived through a single lawyer standing beside a quiet table, holding a sealed envelope bearing the private signature of Queen Elizabeth herself. And in the time it took to read those pages, Camilla's entire future at the most iconic royal residence in Britain was erased. The late queen had planted a clause so permanent that it was designed to survive everything that came after her. And here is what makes it absolutely inescapable. No sitting monarch, no senior advisor, no royal marriage can undo what she wrote. This was never a gentle preference or a quiet hope. It was a legal decree engineered to withstand new kings, new titles, shifting households, every possible change. So before a single word of argument could even begin, the verdict was already locked in. Before we break down what this means for the royal family going forward, take 1 second and subscribe to Royal Decode so you stay current on this unfolding situation. It genuinely supports the channel, and honestly, this story is still developing by the hour. Now imagine the scene. Senior palace lawyers gathered King Charles, Prince William, Princess Anne, and Camilla inside Windsor's administrative section after royal archivists confirmed the authenticity of a sealed addendum attached to the late Queen's estate directions. An addendum, simply put, is a legal attachment added to an existing document, and this one carried the weight of a private royal command. The location mattered deeply. Windsor is not merely a residence. It stands as the embodiment of continuity, of family authority, of everything the late monarch represented and built over 7 decades. The lead solicitor opened the folder and read the contents plainly, with no diplomatic cushioning, no softened phrasing. Not one person in that room spoke up to question the language. Queen Elizabeth's clause permanently forbade Camilla, the queen consort, from residing at Windsor Castle, from maintaining private quarters within its walls, and from exercising any authority over the household staff inside the grounds. Charles said nothing. His grip tightened against the table's edge because in that instant, he grasped something that must have struck him like a sledgehammer. Even as the reigning sovereign, he possessed no power to reverse what his mother had deliberately constructed to outlast his own reign. At first, Camilla assumed the restriction was ceremonial in nature. Perhaps she could no longer host specific functions or occupy certain positions during formal events. But then the lawyer laid out the full scope of the ban, and it was far more sweeping than anything she had anticipated. No overnight stays permitted, no private office space, no authority over staff hiring or appointments. And here's the detail that truly cuts to the bone. No widowhood arrangement inside Windsor under any circumstances. They had accounted for the possibility that Charles might pass away before her, and they ensured that even in that scenario, she would have no right to remain within those walls. The expression on her face shifted the moment that reality settled in. This was not a temporary setback or a symbolic gesture. It reached into every version of the future she had ever pictured alongside the king. Anne noticed a second sealed page resting underneath the first document. She asked the solicitor what it contained, but he declined to disclose its contents until every individual present had formally accepted the restriction now on the table. William remained motionless, though the look he exchanged with the Princess Royal suggested he was aware of far more than he was willing to voice. And then Camilla did something that reveals exactly the state of mind she was in. She reached into her handbag, pulled out her Windsor security access card, and set it down firmly on the polished surface of the table. The solicitor turned back toward her and calmly informed her that palace security would deactivate that card before the sun went down. She pushed her chair backward and demanded to know what the late queen had found so untrustworthy about her that she would construct a legal barrier of this magnitude. Charles kept his eyes lowered. William glanced toward Anne, and buried somewhere within their shared silence was an episode the family had quietly buried for years. The clause had effectively slammed Windsor's gates shut, but the deepest wound was not the restriction itself. It was the realization that Queen Elizabeth had anticipated this precise confrontation long before anyone else could see it coming. For Charles, Windsor had never been merely architecture, ceremony, and centuries of royal custom. It was personal memory. It was obligation. It was the place where his mother had steadied the monarchy through its most turbulent chapters. And now, the woman he loved had been legally carved away from that legacy by the very mother he still grieved for. One signature had trapped him between two loyalties, and whichever direction he chose was going to feel like a betrayal of someone he loved. He had spent years trying to harmonize his marriage with the demands of the crown, believing that patience and service and gradual public acceptance had finally cemented Camilla's position within the institution. But Windsor carries a meaning that cuts differently for every person tangled in this dispute. For the king, it holds his mother's lingering presence. For William, it embodies continuity, the seamless passage of duty from one reign to the next. For Anne, it commands obedience above all else. And for Camilla, it had become the ultimate test of whether she truly belonged inside the royal family. She waited until the two of them were alone before she spoke. Her fury had dissolved into something more subdued and far more painful. Charles attempted to reason with her, explaining that defying the clause could trigger both a rupture within the family and a constitutional crisis, meaning a confrontation over whether a monarch could simply ignore a binding legal instruction tied to royal property and household authority. But what she heard was not a legal defense. She heard hesitation. She heard a husband mentally preparing to sacrifice her future to the judgment of a woman who was no longer alive to justify or explain her decision. Camilla asked whether she would forever remain a barely tolerated outsider, even after years of unwavering loyalty at his side. The king started to speak, then stopped. That silence wounded her more deeply than any blunt rejection ever could have. She asked whether he would walk out of Windsor with her that very evening. He glanced toward the closed door and replied quietly that he was required to stay for the next legal briefing. She gave a single nod, but the silence that filled the space between them carried accusation, grief, and defeat all at once. William located Anne in a nearby hallway and kept his voice low. The prince believed the clause had been written not merely to keep Camilla out, but to prevent a quiet shift of operational control after Charles ascended to the throne. Anne acknowledged that their mother had once cautioned her that royal residences were almost never seized through outright ownership. They were absorbed silently through staff appointments, private office assignments, guest list manipulation, security credentials, influence over daily schedules. Piece by piece, authority could migrate before anyone publicly acknowledged what had happened. That insight is arguably the most revealing element of this entire situation because it redefines everything. It was never about whether Camilla was kind or cruel or widely liked. It was about whether the practical control of Windsor could transfer hands invisibly through hundreds of small administrative choices that no one would notice until it was too late. Charles returned to the legal room and requested the full confidential background behind the restriction. The solicitor produced a separate file and disclosed that a single ceremony at Windsor had permanently altered Queen Elizabeth's perception of Camilla. His choice to remain for that private briefing did not destroy their marriage, but it reopened an old fracture, one that had formed on the very night Queen Elizabeth concluded that Windsor could never be permitted to pass into Camilla's hands. Long before any lawyer unsealed that document, Windsor had been the site of a private confrontation that almost no one recognized for what it was at the time. It took place following a memorial reception, when a contested guest list, a locked suite of rooms, and one unauthorized instruction reached Queen Elizabeth almost simultaneously. By midnight, the monarch had reached a decision that would endure beyond her lifetime, and one woman's future inside the castle was effectively finished. Here is what had been unfolding in the background. Camilla's household had been steadily expanding its influence during the final years of the Queen's reign. Requests kept coming in: more office space, expanded access to guest suites, a larger role in ceremonial planning, tighter control over private staff in anticipation of the succession. Queen Elizabeth permitted limited cooperation, but refused to allow Windsor's authority to drift before the crown officially transferred to Charles. To her, the castle was not simply a home. It was an active center of command, and even minor adjustments could expose who believed the next reign had already quietly begun. The breaking point arrived after a private memorial reception honoring Prince Philip. Camilla directed a senior housekeeper to prepare the former East Terrace rooms for her own use during an upcoming royal gathering. The instruction was issued without the monarch's knowledge or consent. Those rooms carried profound family significance because they had belonged to Elizabeth's private household, and repurposing them would have communicated something far beyond mere convenience. It would have signaled a transfer of authority before one had been granted. The housekeeper approached the Queen after the reception, visibly unsettled, and asked whether she genuinely intended to relinquish those rooms while she was still living. Elizabeth grasped the implication instantly. She summoned Camilla privately and asked who had authorized the decision. The future queen consort replied that she was simply preparing for continuity. But the monarch detected something colder beneath that explanation. She heard a claim being staked before permission had ever been extended. Queen Elizabeth took the proposed room assignment document, folded it once without reading it aloud, and placed it beneath the silver paperweight on her desk before telling Camilla, "These rooms are not waiting for you." That same evening, Elizabeth summoned Anne and dictated the original version of the Windsor restriction. She explained that serving beside the sovereign did not automatically grant anyone guardianship over the royal inheritance. Later, palace lawyers reinforced the language and inserted a clause preventing any future king from granting Camilla residential authority through a new warrant, which is essentially an official written authorization issued by the monarch. Months later, Charles discovered that his mother had issued a serious warning. He chose to remain silent, hoping the tension would dissipate over time. Instead, the warning became permanent law. The clause was forged from that single sentence. But when Camilla discovered that Charles had known about the warning and said nothing, Windsor's legal battle transformed into a deeply personal confrontation between husband and wife. She could withstand the cold assessments of solicitors, the rigid phrasing of sealed legal documents, even the indignity of surrendering her access card. What she could not withstand was the knowledge that Charles had been warned and had kept it from her. Behind closed doors, the legal dispute became a reckoning within the marriage itself. No aides stood between them. No carefully prepared statements softened what was said. There was only anger and grief, and a question the king had avoided answering for years. Camilla carried the historical file into a private drawing room and set it down in front of Charles with both hands. Her voice remained steady at first, but that very control made the accusation land harder. She demanded to know exactly when he had first learned that Queen Elizabeth was considering restrictions on her role at Windsor. The king conceded that his mother had expressed concerns about household boundaries, meaning restrictions on who could control rooms, staff, access, and day-to-day decisions within a royal residence. He maintained that he had never seen the final clause and had assumed the disagreement had ended after the East Terrace incident. Camilla refused to accept that explanation. She reminded him of the years she had spent at his side through scandal, rejection, public hostility, private humiliation. And now, she told him, he was safeguarding the memory of a deceased queen while allowing the living woman beside him to absorb the punishment alone. Charles replied that defending her could not mean dismantling his mother's final instruction. William and Anne regarded the clause as a direct order to protect Windsor's institutional identity, the castle's function as a symbol of continuity that transcended any individual marriage or reign. Then Camilla revealed something no one in the legal room had been aware of. She had already signed off on preliminary plans for a permanent Windsor office, including staff transfers and a private communications setup, operating under the assumption that the king would formalize everything at a later date. Charles stared at her in silence. Those plans made the late monarch's concerns look less like suspicion and more like prophecy. William entered only after hearing their voices escalate. The prince confirmed that every proposed transfer had been halted immediately. Camilla turned on him at once, accusing the future king of weaponizing his grandmother's clause to accelerate her removal. He denied acting out of vengeance, but his composure only intensified her rage. Camilla demanded that Charles look her in the eye and promise he would overturn the clause. He reached toward her, but she stepped back, and the distance that opened between them became the answer neither of them could verbalize. Neither was willing to speak. Anne arrived carrying the second sealed page. She did not hand it to Charles. She placed it in front of the solicitor and stood still. Their confrontation had exposed the marriage beneath the monarchy. But that second sealed page was about to reveal that emotional loyalty no longer determined who controlled Windsor's future. The second page offered no sympathy, no explanation, no room for compromise. It named the guardian. Queen Elizabeth had foreseen that Charles might one day find himself trapped between his wife and his inheritance. so she removed the final decision from his hands entirely. The authority to enforce the Windsor Clause was assigned to the one royal she trusted to act without sentiment, without hesitation, without concern for personal cost: Princess Anne. Anne did not celebrate. She stood beside the solicitor as he explained that she had been designated permanent family custodian of the restriction, meaning she bore the responsibility to challenge any household order designed to circumvent the late Queen's command. Her authority did not make her the owner of Windsor or place her above the sovereign. It granted her one specific but decisive responsibility: safeguarding residential access, private quarters, and household appointments connected to Camilla. Charles absorbed the implications in silence. His mother had entrusted his sister with enforcing a decision she believed he might be too emotionally conflicted to carry through himself. That realization cut deeper than any legal language ever could. The king remained sovereign, yet within this one matter, his judgment had been constrained by someone who had understood his vulnerabilities better than anyone alive, and turned toward her brother and told him she felt no triumph. She would relinquish the burden immediately, she said, if doing so would not betray their mother's final wishes. Charles looked at her and recognized that she was suffering as well. Duty had not spared the Princess Royal. It had merely denied her the freedom to choose the easier path. The solicitor continued, explaining that Camilla could attend ceremonies at Windsor only as an invited consort, with approval required for every individual visit. Repeated attendance could never be converted into a claim of residence. Then Anne uncovered something even more troubling. Several recent staffing requests had been specifically engineered to establish a permanent Queen Consort's unit within the castle. Such a unit would have placed offices, aides, communications, and daily household control under Camilla's authority without formally granting her private rooms. It was precisely the type of silent power transfer Queen Elizabeth had warned against. Anne signed an immediate suspension order. Offices would be cancelled. Staff transfers would be reversed. Every arrangement tied to the proposed unit had to be dismantled before morning. She placed the enforcement document in front of Charles, turned the pen toward him, and waited. After a prolonged silence, the king signed his acknowledgement, while his sister kept one hand pressed flat against the page. When the room emptied, Anne stayed behind. She looked at her mother's signature, tears forming in her eyes, before she folded the document and returned to her duties. The authority had finally been identified, but the moment Anne enforced it, the clause ceased to be an old family secret and began reshaping lives throughout Windsor Castle. By dawn, Windsor was already transforming. Doors that had once opened on recognition now required written authorization. Staff who had been expecting new assignments received cancellation notices instead. A private office that had been prepared for Camilla was cleared out before she ever set foot inside it. The clause was no longer a sentence buried within a sealed file. It had become a tangible reality measured in removed photographs, returned keys, silent corridors, and one royal departure that no one could disguise. The suspension order moved through the castle before breakfast was even served. Security teams received updated access protocols. Household managers canceled room allocations. Transportation staff removed Windsor from Camilla's personal schedule, while the king's private secretary was directed to separate her operations from the castle without delay. The order did not strip away her ceremonial role. She could still attend formal engagements alongside Charles, but every residential privilege, every unsupervised visit, every staffing authority, and every personal use of Windsor facilities had been terminated. Camilla walked into the office that had been set up for her future team and stopped. The desks had been emptied. Communication equipment had been removed. Only a small box of personal stationery remained sitting beside the door. Her longtime aide suggested challenging the decision publicly, arguing that staying silent would make the humiliation appear deserved. She declined. An open assault on Queen Elizabeth's instruction would isolate Charles, alienate William, and force Anne to defend the clause even more aggressively. Security officials delivered the next blow with careful formality. Even during state occasions, the Queen Consort would be required to depart after the official program concluded, unless Anne granted exceptional written permission. A state occasion refers to a formal event conducted in the name of the Crown, but the explanation provided no comfort whatsoever. Camilla could enter as part of the monarchy and still be forbidden from remaining as family. Charles searched frantically for an alternative. He asked whether a private apartment could be established under a different household name, perhaps attached to his own office rather than hers. The solicitor replied that the clause had anticipated that exact maneuver. No renamed department, no secondary suite, no sovereign warrant could restore residential control at the castle. Camilla handed her keyring to the security officer, but one small brass key remained caught around her finger. She removed it slowly, placed it in his open palm, and walked toward the waiting car without turning around. Charles watched from an upper corridor. He raised one hand toward the window, then let it drop when he realized she could not see him. Before the car pulled away, William sent a message requesting to speak with Camilla privately. The request arrived with no explanation attached. It could lead to another rejection or the first genuine peace Windsor had ever offered. Windsor had enforced the Queen's judgment with ruthless precision, yet one private conversation still held the power to determine whether the family would emerge fractured or finally comprehend what the clause was meant to protect. William did not approach Camilla as an heir confronting a defeated consort. He approached her as a son who understood what it meant to live under the crushing weight of the past. With no lawyers present, no aides, no family witnesses, they sat across from each other inside a small room located beyond Windsor's private chapel. For the first time, the conversation shifted away from access and authority and moved toward wounds neither of them had ever named aloud. William had requested the meeting because he believed that continued humiliation would damage Charles, fracture the family, and transform Queen Elizabeth's protective clause into an instrument of revenge. A protective clause is a binding instruction created to safeguard a specific royal interest, but he recognized that its purpose could be corrupted if the family wielded it as punishment rather than protection. Camilla arrived anticipating another set of demands. Instead, the prince began by acknowledging that the restriction did not erase her years of service or her position beside the king. Camilla gradually lowered her guard. Losing Windsor, she admitted, hurt because it confirmed her deepest and oldest fear. No amount of loyalty, duty, or public endurance could release her from the judgments attached to the origins of her relationship with Charles. She had survived scandal and rejection, yet a single sealed page had made the past feel permanent and inescapable. William did not dismiss what she was feeling. He explained that Windsor held memories of his grandmother, the suffering of his mother, and the monarchy he would one day inherit. Every proposed office, every staff transfer, every private suite felt deeply personal to him, even when presented as routine administration. To him, the castle was not territory to be claimed. It was a trust to be safeguarded. Then the future king put forward a settlement. Camilla would retain full ceremonial dignity and receive an independent household located elsewhere, while Windsor's private guardianship would remain with the direct line of succession, meaning the heirs who inherit the crown in order. She agreed not to contest the clause, on the condition that the palace did not characterize her departure as punishment and did not destroy the careers of staff who had remained loyal. Camilla asked whether William believed Queen Elizabeth had despised her. He paused before responding. The late monarch, he said, feared what unchecked power could do to the family. She had never denied Camilla's humanity. Before standing to leave, the queen consort touched the back of the empty chair beside her and said quietly that she wished this conversation had taken place years earlier, when forgiveness might have cost less. William promised to bring the agreement directly to Charles. Then he warned her that details from the solicitors' meeting had already leaked to the press. The private settlement had prevented a family war, but beyond Windsor's walls, the secret clause was already transforming into a national verdict on memory, marriage, and the boundaries of royal authority. At sunrise, the secret escaped the palace. Britain woke to a royal restriction unlike anything announced in modern memory. A reigning queen consort permanently forbidden from making Windsor Castle her home. The public did not receive the story as a technical legal dispute. They perceived it as a final command from Queen Elizabeth, a rebuke delivered across time, and a family compelled to confront wounds the crown had spent decades attempting to contain. The palace responded swiftly, releasing a formal statement before speculation could spiral beyond control. It confirmed that the late monarch had established a binding private residential instruction, and that Charles, William, Anne, and Camilla had agreed to honor it. A residential instruction is a legally protected directive governing who may live in or exercise private authority over a royal property. The wording sounded composed. Its meaning was devastating. Broadcasters clarified that Camilla remained queen consort and would continue performing her public duties alongside the king. However, Windsor's apartments, household structure, staffing decisions, and long-term guardianship would remain permanently beyond her reach. Supporters of Elizabeth praised the clause as necessary protection for the crown. Others characterized it as a final humiliation imposed on a woman who had spent decades standing beside Charles through hostility, scandal, and relentless public judgment. Charles observed the coverage without saying a word. Commentators repeatedly framed the decision as his mother's triumph over his wife, converting private grief into a public competition between two women he loved. The king refused to react, but Anne recognized the pain concealed beneath his silence. She later appeared alongside her brother at an official engagement, standing close enough to communicate one message without ambiguity. The siblings remained united even after their mother's instruction had placed enforcement authority in her hands. The palace then released word of a negotiated settlement. William and Camilla had reached an agreement under which she voluntarily relinquished any legal challenge and accepted a separate permanent household. The revelation tempered some criticism, but it also confirmed that the exclusion was final and irreversible. Outside Windsor's Henry VIII Gate, a crowd assembled beneath newspaper billboards carrying the headline, "The Queen's Last Command." At exactly noon, the castle flag rose as Camilla's car passed without entering, and the silent crowd watched the vehicle continue down the long approach road. Inside the car, she saw the headline, closed her eyes for a single breath, then straightened herself before the cameras could capture her pain. Ahead lay one final appearance at Windsor, where she would enter solely as an invited consort. The country had delivered its reaction, but the true meaning of the clause would be determined by the family's final return to Windsor and by the dignity each person carried through the gate. The ultimate test did not take place inside a courtroom or a solicitor's office. It took place at Windsor itself. Camilla returned for a memorial service under the terms she had accepted, not as a resident, not as a household authority figure, but as the king's consort and a member of the royal family. Every step she took carried the weight of rejection, yet what occurred before she left transformed the clause from an instrument of humiliation into a boundary the monarchy could finally endure. Camilla entered through the public ceremonial entrance, and officials logged her visit as lasting only for the duration of the service. A ceremonial entrance is the official route used for royal duties, not for private residence. Windsor was no longer a place she could call home. Charles stood beside her, making one truth impossible to miss. Honoring his mother's instruction did not require him to abandon his wife or deny her dignity. Camilla paused near the corridor that led toward the former private apartments. She understood she would never cross that threshold again as part of her household. Anne approached without any sign of triumph. The Princess Royal acknowledged that enforcing the clause had caused real pain, but maintained that their shared duty was to prevent personal authority from overtaking the institution they had inherited. Camilla responded with quiet finality. She would never pursue Windsor access again. Then she handed Anne a signed confirmation dissolving the proposed Queen Consort's unit, the staff structure that would have granted her permanent influence inside the castle. William had ordered the East Terrace rooms preserved as part of Queen Elizabeth's historical household. The future king also approved a separate residence where Camilla could serve beside Charles without competing for Windsor's legacy. Before departing, Camilla placed her signed renunciation on a small table beneath Queen Elizabeth's portrait. Anne took the document, but instead of turning away immediately, she extended her hand. Camilla accepted it. Charles watched in silence as the two women released years of hostility without pretending the pain had never existed. Queen Elizabeth's clause did not destroy the monarchy, and it did not end Charles and Camilla's marriage. What it actually accomplished was the creation of a boundary between love and duty. Windsor remained protected. The marriage endured. Anne fulfilled her mother's command. William safeguarded the inheritance he carries. And Camilla chose dignity over a battle she could not win. She lost the castle that might have finally confirmed her acceptance. Yet by refusing revenge, she gained something that authority could never command: respect. The gates closed behind Camilla for the final time as a would-be resident, and Windsor remained exactly where Queen Elizabeth had placed it, beyond possession, beyond marriage, and preserved for the generations to come.